So you've got yourself a Sprocket Rocket, or you're thinking about getting one, but you're not quite sure how to get the most out of this interesting little camera. This is the video for you. I'm going to give you a quick rundown about the camera and share 6 tips on how to make the most of it. Let's talk about it. The Sprocket Rocket is Lomography's 35mm panoramic camera. Not only does it give you a photo with a 1:3 panoramic aspect ratio from its 30mm focal length lens, but it also allows you to expose the sprocket holes for your photos so you get this cool effect. Sprocket Rocket has 2 apertures, f10.8 and f16, and 2 shutter speeds, 1/100th of a second, which is kind of the normal, and then bulb. So what does that all mean? I'm glad you asked. 1, you will get really wide photos so you can capture a lot of a scene. 2, you probably won't get much, if any, bokeh. That's that dreamy, blurry background that you sometimes see in photos. 3, you'll pretty much only have 1 shutter speed option unless you use a tripod, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, let's jump into some tips I have to help you get the most out of your Sprocket Rocket. Tip number 1, choose film that has ISO 400 or higher. So long story short, the ISO is how sensitive your film is to light. The smaller the ISO number, the less sensitive your film is to light. This camera, I would say, is meh on how much light it lets in, regardless of the film's ISO. So I recommend a film with an ISO of at least 400. Long story long, your camera determines how to expose a scene based on the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. These are known as the exposure triangle. When you change one, you affect the others. I would say this camera has a medium shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, but smaller apertures. The slower the shutter speed, for example 1/60th of a second, the more light is let into your camera, and the opposite happens for a faster shutter speed like 1/500th of a second. The smaller the aperture, the less light you're letting into your camera as well. So in general, you have a camera that on its own doesn't necessarily let in a lot of light, regardless of the film's ISO. This is why I recommend a higher ISO film. It helps combat the medium shutter speed and smaller apertures of the Sprocket Rocket. Now, that isn't to say you can't get good Sprocket Rocket photos with ISO 100 or 200 film. But if you are using one of those types of films, I recommend shooting it during really sunny days or using the bulb mode. If you want to know more about ISO, check out the video in the card above. Tip number 2, use a tripod or flat surface. Speaking of bulb mode, if you're going to use that mode, I highly recommend using a tripod or a hard flat surface. This will help stabilize the camera as you take a photo. One thing of note, however, if you're not going to use a tripod and you're going to stick with just a flat surface, make sure you don't let your camera slide too much around the flat surface. Bulb mode simply means the shutter will stay open until you release the shutter lever. The longer you hold the lever open, the more light you let in. However, you also have a greater opportunity to introduce something called camera shake into your photo. Camera shake can be the micro movement that comes from releasing the shutter lever. Usually the camera shutter opens and closes quick enough where you won't notice any camera shake. Think of how quickly you blink. However, because you're using bulb mode, you're extending the time between the open and close of the shutter, and your camera may capture some micro movements, and thus you get a slightly blurry image. You can kind of see that here in this photo I took of Lost Planet and like the giant gorilla face. I wasn't trying to shoot in bulb mode, so I don't know if maybe the lever switched over to bulb by mistake, but you can definitely tell this image is blurry and a bit more blown out than it had any right to be, kind of based on what the settings I thought I had. So here's a photo I took during blue hour from my house, and I just put the camera on a flat surface and I used bulb mode. I made sure that when I release the shutter lever, I release it slowly so as not to have any micro movements into the image, and I think it comes out pretty clear minus the grain from like the low light. Tip number 3, shoot in bright or partially cloudy scenes. You know how in tip number 1 I mentioned that the camera is meh on how much light it lets in? Well, that's why I recommend shooting in bright or partially cloudy settings. Film loves light. Unlike with digital, you would do better to overexpose a shot than underexpose it when it comes to shooting film. ISO 400 combined with a bright or partially cloudy day gives you some of the best chances of getting well exposed images, especially since you don't have a lot of range with the camera settings. I wouldn't recommend shooting the Sprocket Rocket indoors unless your scene has a lot of natural or artificial light. Remember, your eyes deceive you when it comes to just how bright an actual scene is. Tip number 4, get close. Now I know this next tip may seem counterintuitive for a panoramic camera, but hear me out. Yes, it is cool to get a wide spanning landscape shot, but it can be equally as cool to get a close-up wide-angle shot that makes your subject appear larger than life. I love taking photos like these because it isn't something you see every day. It allows you to share a different perspective of something that people may not normally get to see. Remember, the minimum focusing distance for this camera is 0.6 meters or about 2 feet. If you're finding these tips useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps others find this video. Tip number 5, try double exposure. One of the benefits about this fully manual camera is that just because you take a photo, it doesn't mean you have to advance to the next frame right away. Enter multiple exposures. Multiple exposures are a fun way to add some creativity and uniqueness to your shots. One tip I will recommend is shooting the first layer of your multiple exposure at f/16. Generally speaking, you want the subject of the first image as dark as possible because that allows whatever is photographed over it to show through more clearly. Remember, you will be exposing the first layer at least twice, so you want to limit how much light hits it initially to try and avoid blowing out that layer. If you want more tips for multiple exposures, check out the video in the card above. It focuses on instant photography, but some of the tips can be applied to film photography as well. Alright, and here we are with tip number 6. Shoot some vertical images. Yes, the camera seems to be built to shoot horizontally, but why not try and capture some really tall buildings or trees? Maybe try some multiple exposures while shooting vertically. And there you have it. Those are my 6 tips for getting the most out of your Sprocket Rocket. It's a fun panoramic camera that can produce some interesting results. Don't be afraid to experiment with it. If you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to receive notifications of when I post new videos. Also, check out my memberships. I'd love to have you. Until next time, keep practicing, keep having fun, and I'll see you in the next video.